A wise man is full of strength, and a man of knowledge enhances his might. For by wise guidance you can wage war. In the abundance of counselors there is victory. War is pervasive within our society and throughout the world. The United States currently remains engaged in a so-called war on terror. What does that mean? Samuel Nunn, professor at the University of Indiana, noted that between January 1st, 1997 and September 11th, 2005, 178 terrorist incidents occurred in the United States. 178. Are we a society that's constantly at war? What kind of war, and against whom? I remember the events of 9/11 vividly. I was working for Best Buy and heard over the radio on the way to work that a plane had been flown into one of the towers in the World Trade Center in New York City. I saw the images all day long. By the end of the day, I was left with so many questions for which I continue to seek answers. How do we face these threats? Society has always faced crime and violence. It always will. What's the best way to protect ourselves in this modern world? Picture society in conflict. It's not very hard to do, but what does it look like? Everyone, it seems, has their own agenda. Enemies are all around. Now, picture a society at peace. I don't find that very easy, but when the landscape begins to come into view, I notice something. What's fundamental to a society in conflict is antithetical to a society at peace. Everyone has the same agenda, the good of one another and the good of all. Friends are all around. So how to protect ourselves in the modern world becomes a matter of journeying from conflict to peace. At this point, we're ready to tell John he's lost it. He's gone from war to 9/11 and terrorism to some pie-in-the-sky utopia. Is he trying to lay on me some crazy conspiracy theory? Is he preaching me a sermon? Well, no, not at the moment. I'm just trying to show you that conflict and violence are ever-present realities, that peace seems a great way off, and that we need to take practical steps today if we'd like to fight for safe and peaceful communities. So first, I'm going to tell you a little about terrorism in the modern world and the problems in dealing with it. Then, we're going to look at some ways in which we're attempting to deal with the problem. Finally, we're going to see how the best solution involves the continued vigilance of each and every one of us. So we're going to take a brief look at the history of modern terrorism and the challenges faced by law enforcement. In order to combat this modern threat, one must first seek to understand terrorism's roots and evolution. Terrorism was born out of a desire for political dissent. It was developed in the modern sense by Carlos Marighella, who was a Brazilian legislator and revolutionary theorist and was killed by Brazilian police in 1969. He developed a four-stage urban model which went from unorganized violence among the masses and passive protests, which was designed to provoke repressive response from the government, which led to an even more massive uprising and the eventual toppling of the government. Now, all terrorist organizations in some way put this model into place. They develop either a hierarchy or have some sort of leaderless network, and usually it's a combination of both, with the intent that the head can't be cut off the snake and the whole organization can't fall. Internet recruiting leads to widespread terrorist networks and lone wolves who may operate remotely and yet still be part of the whole. Financing can come in the form of selling drugs or illegal arms, robbery, human trafficking, or as legitimate money is funneled through businesses and charities. Modern terrorist groups are widespread throughout the world. Everyone knows about the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and both of which have given way to present-day ISIS. Jihadists, members of these groups who believe they're engaged in a holy war, haven't been content to remain in their own countries, and there are many homegrown jihadists here on U.S. soil. Everyone knows about these, and this is what's usually pictured as terrorism. But there's a lot of homegrown domestic terrorists here in the United States, and oftentimes, nowadays, the greatest threat comes from the domestic groups, not the foreign groups we see on the news. Christian identity, a white supremacy ideology that has its roots in the Ku Klux Klan, has given rise to domestic groups such as Posse Comitatus and the Aryan Nation. Violent right-wing extremists are comprised of groups like the Michigan Militia and the Branch Davidians, the latter of which was involved in the 1993 standoff in Waco, Texas. And there's also the 1993 bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City, perpetrated by American citizens. Also included in domestic terror groups are eco-terrorists, opponents of genetic engineering, violent anti-abortionists. This presents a problem that's responsible for the loss of countless lives and the destruction of $1 million worth of property. Clearly, there's a need for the development of more effective preventative measures. Now, there are challenges to this. While terrorists are similar to ordinary criminals and they seek to do harm to others, they also differ from them in many ways. Ordinary criminals are generally very impulsive, self-centered, undisciplined, unfocused, and untrained. Terrorists, on the other hand, are highly motivated and they're loyal to a specific cause. They're usually very well trained. They find strength in a cause, ideology, or religion, and they're extremely dedicated, refusing to betray their cause even at great cost to themselves. With these differences noted, police and other law enforcement agencies can't respond to terrorists in the same way. To combat ordinary criminals, police may protect targets, deny opportunity, conduct aggressive patrols. And while these can be useful in combating terrorism, there have to be differences in how law enforcement handles terrorism. As noted by Professor Jonathan R. White, terrorism investigations involve long-term observation, informant development, and evidence collection. It's usually a lengthy process of piecing together elements of a criminal conspiracy. Now, in reaction to these threats, law enforcement has looked at various options for dealing with them in an effective manner. Among these options, we'll look at three in particular: intelligence-led policing, defense in depth, and militarization. One such preventative measure is called intelligence-led policing. According to White, this is a type of law enforcement in which resources are deployed based on information gathered and analyzed from criminal intelligence. It's a means of making policing less reactive and more proactive. It's an idea that's based on police forming partnerships with the communities they serve. These partnerships are designed to unite police and their communities in the sharing of information. In the United States, this means sharing intelligence across the federal, state, local, and tribal levels. But in order for this to work, there has to be cooperation among these different levels, but this is often hindered by interagency resentment. This presents a huge problem in trying to combat terrorism. Terrorist activities are first often encountered at the local level. If local and state police aren't trained to distinguish between terrorist activity and normal criminal activity, then they'll likely handle both as normal criminal activity and won't pass useful information on to intelligence agencies. Nor will the intelligence agencies at the top spread the information down at the bottom because they see the agencies at the bottom as incompetent. In addition to this conflict, there's also issues in terms of the type of intelligence that local agencies can gather. They can only gather intelligence called criminal intelligence based on criminal investigations. Gathering intelligence on terrorism activities means they would need to gather national security intelligence, which mainly has to do with political activities and carries with it the strong possibility of civil rights violations. A second possible solution to the problem of terrorism is called defense in depth. White comments that the idea of defense in depth is that all levels of society must become involved in homeland security. Defense in depth is designed to protect a community fighting for its way of life. Community policing, in this sense, is not merely an idea of police developing networks within the communities, but rather involves everyone in the community taking a more active role in fighting for a common goal, namely the safety and well-being of that community. The idea of defense in depth involves increased security measures, often at the expense of personal liberties. Benefits include the building of community networks, increased information sharing, and an increased level of safety and security. Third possible solution is one of the militarization of police forces. Police forces, in this instance, don't act with individual discretion, but are bound, as White says, by strict obedience to orders and aggressive action in the face of an enemy. The idea in this sort of model is to address social problems using military tactics. This approach has proved useful in certain instances, as with violent demonstrators, hostage situations, or lone gunmen on killing sprees. However, police officers may end up seeing their communities as a war zone, and this may affect the attitude they have in dealing with their community. So we need to see how we're going to combine areas from these different models along with personal vigilance in order to give ourselves the best chances for safety and peace. When the best parts of these models are combined, used effectively, and partnered with community involvement, we then give ourselves strong weapons in the fight against terror. We must combine some of the principles of intelligence-led policing with defense in depth and save any type of military response as a last resort. Mandatory measures need to be put in place to ensure the sharing of resources among all levels. Also, there needs to be a push to install leadership that will change the culture in regards to how all these agencies form partnerships and interact. Bias and resentment need to be put aside, and those who show a reluctance to do so need to be censured and removed from their posts. There must be a recruitment of more police officers who have obtained an education with an emphasis in with critical thinking, and these officers must be trained to look beyond the normal scope of their duties and recognize signs of terrorist activity. All of these recommendations come with the need for increased oversight. All of us together have to hold our officials accountable and become involved in the vigilant defense of our communities. Without this type of involvement, either civil liberties will be trampled upon, or we'll find ourselves living in communities of detached and apathetic strangers. Professor Leo Buscaglia said that he had a very strong feeling that the opposite of love is not hate, it's apathy. It's not giving a damn. I'd agree in some manner, at least in the fact that apathy is passive hatred. We must become involved. Now, I've told you a little about terrorism in the modern world and the problems in dealing with it. We've looked at some ways in which we're attempting to deal with the problem. And now we've seen how the best solution involves the continued vigilance of each and every one of us. Terrorism and the ways in which we choose to deal with it affects us and the communities in which we live. We have to make decisions on whether or not we're going to be involved in finding and maintaining the balance between personal liberty and security. And we're going to have to live with the consequences of that decision. As French political philosopher Charles de Montesquieu said, the tyranny of a prince in an oligarchy is not so dangerous to the public welfare as the apathy of a citizen in democracy. A wise man is full of strength. A man of knowledge enhances his might. For by wise guidance you can wage your war. In the abundance of counselors there is victory. Proverbs 24:6. Each and every one of you needs to decide what kind of society you want to live in. You don't have to do an awful lot if you want conflict. It's all around. But if you want peace, it comes at a cost. The cost is the personal and sacrificial involvement of each and every one of you. If you're not willing to accept that cost, then you must instead accept the cost of continued violence and conflict.